Hey everybody, it's Jet Girl here, and today we're going to be changing some strings on my classic Fender Stratocaster. I was playing a gig with this guitar recently when the D string suddenly decided it was going to explode. And since it was already about time for a string change, I wasn't super surprised. If you haven't changed strings before, usually one of the first things I do is loosen all of the tension on the strings. In order to put the new strings on, you need to take off the old ones first. And if there's too much tension on these strings when you go to cut them, they might fly around and they could possibly hit you in the face. Cutting the strings is pretty easy. I usually use scythe pliers, but the scythe pliers in the basement have been missing for 800 years. I promise I don't know where they are, Dad. So instead I'm going to be using some needle nose pliers. Usually when I remove the strings, I like to take the time to clean the guitar, especially since now that the strings are out of the way, I have quite a bit more room to clean some of the places you can't always get to. It's always good to kind of clean your guitar frequently, especially the metal pieces like the input jack and the saddle. Over time, they can get tarnished, and this can lead to rusting easier. I use a regular rag first, normally, just to kind of get any excess dust and stuff off so I don't scratch the paint or the pickguard. And then I use guitar polish and a microfiber rag to really clean the entire guitar, including the fretboard. And if you are using polish, you don't want to use too much because it can kind of mess up the paint over time. And so normally I just use a little bit, and I really try to make sure I get all of it off so none of it just like sits and festers over time. Now that everything is nice, shiny, and clean, it's time to put on some new strings. I have about 3 different sets of strings that I normally use. They're the Ernie Ball 8 and 7 gauge strings, and then the Sheptone 9 gauge strings. I will be putting on the 8 gauge Ernie Ball strings. Before I put on the strings, I need to make sure that the tuning peg holes are facing the saddle of the guitar. This usually just makes feeding the guitar string into the hole a lot easier. As you can see though, when I'm moving the tuning pegs, they are quite a bit loose, so I pull out the trusty 10mm and I tighten those up just a little bit. You want to be careful when you do this because you can cause the tuner part of the tuning peg to move around, and that kind of messes up the space between the tuners. So just make sure you kind of really hold it in place before you tighten them. And after that's done, we get to flip the guitar over. Depending on what kind of guitar you have is going to be where you feed the strings through. Since the guitar I'm using is a Strat, usually you feed the strings in through the back of the guitar. When you take a string out of the package, usually they're kind of coiled, and there's a lot of debate about how you're supposed to take the strings out of the package, but I think as long as you're not uncoiling the strings and they're, flying across the room, that they're not really going to magically become dull. Once you feed the string through the tuning peg, you're going to want to pull it tight. Then from there, you're going to do a little bit of measuring. When putting strings on your guitar, you're not going to just start wrapping the guitar string from where it is pulled tight. You're going to want to give it some wiggle room, and depending on your scale length or maybe the size of your strings is kind of going to dictate how much extra wiggle room you're going to need. Since I'm doing my low E string and I'm using a little bit of a lighter gauge string, I probably want no more than about 1.5 inches of extra space. This also helps ensure that you have enough coil around the tuning peg to push up on the end of the string so that it doesn't slip out of place. Once you figure out how much extra wiggle room you need, you're going to take the end of that section and then you're going to push it back to the tuning peg. From there, you're going to take the string and you're going to bend it at an angle. The direction you bend your string in will kind of be dictated by which way your tuning pegs are turning. Since this is a Strat and they all tune the same direction, they will all be bent in the same direction. Once you get it bent, you're going to slowly start to turn it just a little bit so you can get enough tension on it to where you can get a good grip on the string and pull it tight. Keeping the string tight while it's feeding through the tuning peg is kind of essential. For these particular tuning pegs, you're going to want to kind of push down a little bit on the part that is feeding in through the tuner because it needs to wrap underneath the end of the string that is already in the tuning peg. You can see as I start to wind the string that it's already starting to coil and then it's slowly pushing up on that end of the string. Now that the string is finished, you can really see how the coil is pushing up on that end of the string, and that when I wiggle it around a little bit, it's not going anywhere. Now that we're done with the first string, we can move on to the rest. The process for putting on the rest of the strings is going to be about the same. The only thing that's going to change is about how much wiggle room each string needs. The lighter strings will need a little bit more wiggle room because they are quite a bit thinner and will need a lot more pushing up on them in order for them to not slip out of place. If you're like me and you like lighter strings, it's not very easy to put them on. You need to get a pretty good grip on the strings in order to keep that tension while you're winding them, and with the smaller strings, it's like you're holding little pieces of hair. And thankfully, I was able to capture what happens when you don't put enough tension on the strings and the coil doesn't push up enough on the end of the string. Once I had finished doing the high E string, I started to slowly tune it up, and then all of a sudden, I heard a very loud popping noise. Thankfully, after checking the entire string, I was able to see that it wasn't actually broken, it had just slipped out of place. I was able to get the string rewrapped on the tuning peg, and then this time I made sure not to do it wrong. After I finished tuning all the strings, I realized I hadn't fed them through this little piece on the headstock correctly, so I went through and adjusted that. And here is a lovely shot of all of those beautiful coils. And if you didn't notice, one of them was very wrong, and I had to go back and fix that string as well. Once all the strings are pretty close in tune, it's time to take it to the guitar room to test it out. My method for checking to see if the strings were placed properly is usually bending all of the strings like crazy and then going through and playing some open chords, since those will usually tell you when something's really out of tune. And you'll be able to tell if a string wasn't coiled properly because they will either go very out of tune or they will pop out of place completely like the E string did. It's my favorite part of the day where I clean up all 7,000 of the things that I got out. When it comes to putting strings on guitars, not all of them are built the same, especially when it comes to there being a variety of different tuners you can find, like locking tuners and vintage tuners. So eventually I'm going to be going over how to put strings on a variety of different guitars, especially since I have a variety of different guitars. Not so sure about the Floyd Roses though. It's a little bit of a nightmare fuel for me. My next big project will be cleaning my lovely little Washburn guitar that is actually basically just a parts guitar. I think it could use a little love though. Thanks for watching!